So let's look at some more concepts in servlets. That is, we have something called as server side includes, servlet chaining, servlet collaboration, send redirect, that is redirecting servlets, and client pull. These are basically the other ways in which you can call your servlets from. Now SSIs are basically nothing but a .shtml file which were supported, or rather still are supported by servlets starting with Servlet 1.0. Now server side includes basically define a .html file with contents of HTML plus the servlet tag. Just like you had an applet tag, we have a servlet tag. In the servlet tag, you specify the code attribute which takes the name of a servlet. You can end your servlet by giving /servlet at this point. So you write a servlet tag with a code attribute having a servlet name. That is, if it belongs to a package, then package name.servlet name. Of course, since you would have specified the alias name, then it's just the alias name that you need to specify here. Once you specify the servlet tag, what happens is when you call for a HTML file actually as a URL, basically at the server side, it executes the servlet tag, and the output of the servlet tag will be embedded at the point where you have written the servlet tag along with your HTML content, and then sends back this to the client. Now this HTML file or server side include is not supported by all the servers. So if in case you have written a HTML file and the server does not support to this, in that case you can also inside the servlet tag write some text content. This text content will get displayed rather than the servlet tag getting executed in case SHTML is not supported. If SHTML is supported, then the text content will not get displayed, it's only the output of the servlet. If you want to pass request parameters to this servlet, then you would pass it using the param tag inside a servlet. Param name is equal to v1, value is equal to val1. So depending on how many parameters you want to pass, that many param tags can exist. So as you can see here, you can't really pass any dynamic client based request parameters because it's all defined out here in the file as static content. That's a drawback out here with SHTML files or the server side includes. Now we usually do not make use of SHTML files or SSIs, but this is one concept which is still available. We have next the servlet chaining. Servlet chaining again is not supported by all the web servers because servlet chaining is not part of the servlet specification. Servlet chaining is supported by servers like JRun, Java Web Server. What we do with servlet chaining is you write set of servlets. These set of servlets which have to be executed one after the other have to be configured in the server. So you go to your administration window. There you get Servlet Aliasing as a tab or an option. So you select this Servlet Aliasing. It will give you a window which consists of two columns. One says the alias name and then here the servlet. So you specify the alias name. Let's say we call it as /chain. We need to click, there will be set of buttons. Add is one of the button. Click at add. It will give you a row in this particular table. You type in the /chain, for example. So you click at the add button and then enter /chain, for example, as a name of an alias, and then in the second column specify the sequence of servlets which have to get executed. So let's assume S1, S2, S3, S4 are the servlets which we have written and we have to execute it in that particular sequence. So comma separated list of servlets are specified here. Now what you need to do to execute is, when you execute, you specify HTTP localhost 8080, your web application name, followed by /chain. When you call with /chain, it will start executing depending on how you have specified the list. So it will execute S1 first, then S2, S3, S4, and finally the last servlet in the chain will give an output to the client. Servlet chaining, what happens is it has to work with only servlets, and these servlets should belong to the same context. And here an output of one servlet becomes an input to the next servlet, and only the last servlet is therefore giving an output to the client. You are still getting your print writer object or your stream object, whatever the case might be, writing it, but whatever you write does not go to the client, it goes to the next servlet as an input. So in the next servlet you can read the contents and then again further process and then again do a write. Why should I use servlet chaining? For example, you can use it for filtering or even internationalization, for example. Let's say the first servlet actually processes the request and gives an output as such out.println, not an output to the client directly. It does an out.println. Now this out.println content, if I have specified the next servlet in a chain, will pick it up depending on the language. It can convert that output to that particular language and then probably present it. So these are a few of the reasons why we can make use of servlet chaining. Now let's look at Servlet Collaboration. Servlet Collaboration, there are two things that you can do with this. This was introduced in 2.1 of servlets. In Servlet Collaboration, you can do what is known as include or forward. That is, forwarding servlets and inlining servlets. Include is otherwise known as inlining servlets. What is the difference between these two? In this case, this is programmatically done. You have an interface called request dispatcher, which you make use of for Servlet Collaboration. To get an instance of type request dispatcher, you invoke a method getRequestDispatcher. This method comes from the servlet context interface. So you need to get the servlet context object first. So you do a get servlet context to get the servlet context object. Then on that you call getRequestDispatcher, you get a request dispatcher object. When you call the getRequestDispatcher, you pass the URI that has to be invoked. It is not the URL, it is the URI. What is the difference between URI and URL? URL consists of the protocol, HTTP for example, followed by the domain name, like your yahoo.com is a domain name, or localhost in this case is our domain name because we are running the server in the same machine and executing, followed by the port number and the path, that is your application name slash the virtual path to your servlet or whatever web page or HTML or whatever. So this entire thing is a URL. Your URI is only the path. So you don't specify the protocol, the domain name and the port number. It's just the path. So you specify this URI, that is the page to be either included or forwarded for when you create an instance of dispatcher. That is when you call get request dispatcher. Now once you have a request dispatcher object, the request dispatcher interface has only two methods, that's include and forward. Either call the include method or the forward method depending on what you want to achieve. When you invoke the include and the forward, there are two parameters that you need to pass to these methods, that is the request and the response objects. So this is how it goes with Servlet Collaboration. Let's assume we have S1 and S2 as servlets. S1 wants to include S2 or forward to S2. And let's look at how to do this and what is the difference between these two methods. So let's assume that we have public class S1 extends HTTP servlet. In this particular servlet, we'll have, let's assume, public void doGet, which takes a HTTP servlet request. Let's call it as REQ, HTTP servlet response, RES. Here you have your response dot set content type, text slash HTML, response dot get writer, print writer object, and probably you do some sort of a processing here. Request processing, and then you probably want to include another page, another servlet out here. So in order to inline another servlet, you need to get the request dispatcher object. So we do a servlet context SC is equal to get servlet context we get the request dispatcher from the servlet context. Get request dispatcher takes the URI as a value, and for this URI you must always start with a slash. That is the root of the context. So you can only specify include or forward to this particular context page, any page which belongs to the same context where S1 is residing. So therefore you need to start with the slash for the context always, followed by the path, the virtual path. Suppose S2 is called as a has a virtual path as /servlet/s2. So we'll say /servlet/s2 out here, right? Then using this request dispatcher object, we call for the include method to inline a servlet, right? When we call a include method, we have to pass the request and response objects as parameters we mentioned, and that request and response is available out here in the doGet method itself. So we pass those particular parameters. Then you can write anything else that you might wish to write in this servlet as well, followed by the include, and end your doGet method. Now what happens is, in this case, whatever the output I might be writing here also goes to the client. When I call include during the runtime, when I have invoked this S1, during the runtime, the specified servlet S2 will get invoked. It executes the doGet or the doPost of the S2 servlet. Whatever the output that S2 is writing, that also goes to the client. After finishes executing S2, it comes back to this caller servlet, which means it comes back here and executes the rest of the contents of this particular servlet to finish giving the response to the client. So in case of an include, you will have an output from S1 as well as you have an output from S2 embedded. Depends on wherever you called include at that point. And with include, the control comes back to the caller servlet. Because we are passing the request response objects to the including servlet as well, whatever request parameters that I am passing to servlet 1 from the client is also available to servlet 2. Maybe like when you have done some request processing here, some information you have derived with, you might want to pass to this including servlet. In that case, how do you pass any extra information to the including servlet? This is done by calling setAttribute method on the request object before calling the include. So you will call for request dot setAttribute passing the variable name and value. So let's say whatever the variable you want to pass, comma value. In this case I am going to show it as a string, but it has to be an object type here as a value. So that if I want to access this particular parameter in the including servlet, that's S2, I would call it as request.getAttribute of var1, downcast it to the appropriate object type because it will return it as a generic object, and then make use of it. Any client request parameter is still available to you from the request object, and you have the same client's response socket because you have the response object being passed as well. So by calling setAttribute on the request object, you are basically, what you are doing is placing some information which any page can access for that particular client within that particular request that the client has made. So if I have multiple includes across the line, suppose S2 might be also having some include, there in that included file also I can access this particular variable. So by placing a variable into a request object using setAttribute, you are placing data into a request scope, which means to say that you are able to access within that single request of that particular user whatever pages that you invoke using the include or the forward, you can access such variables. Also note one more thing, that if your variable name which you are using for set attribute happens to be same as the variable name which is there in the request client request parameter which the client has sent across as information, it does not clash. Those set of client request parameter variables are different from the variables that you are setting out here with the set attribute method, because whatever the client has set will be accessed through the requests get parameter method, and whatever we set with the set attribute you will be accessing using the get attribute method. They are two separate set of variables. But if you happen to have more than one variable which is same in terms of text fields or whatever in the HTML page and in the client request parameter, then depending on the server it acts differently. That is, it could basically take all the variables, because all variables are same for the text fields, it will take all the text field values with comma separated list, it will give it to you as a single string, or it can give you a last value itself alone. Really depends on the server. So that's about the include method. Now looking at the forward method. In case you're going to call a forward method, do not write anything after the forward call, because the control will not come back to the caller servlet. And one more important point is, do not have any out.printlns from here. Do not try to write anything to the client browser, because in case of a forward, all you should do out here in the caller servlet is just do some processing and then call the forward method. If you want to pass extra information, use the set attribute before forward. Okay. So what happens with the forward is, once you forward the request to another servlet, the control not only does not come back, also only the last servlet in the forward will give an output to the client. So you might have multiple forwards. They should not be writing anything to the client browser. Only the last servlet in the, or the last page in the forward should be giving any sort of an output. Even in the forward, suppose I have a forward here and S2 might be having an include. If suppose I'm having an include and a forward in this particular page, then the include file should not have any out.println, because again after include I am calling for forward. And suppose there is an include in S2, and S2 happens to be the last servlet in the forward, then it can have an include with out.printlns. If not, it should not be having, okay, as it is the last servlet, it should be able to write the output. So the difference between include and forward, we can conclude it as, include is going to inline the content by outputting the entire thing to the client, and the control comes back to the calling servlet. With the forward, the control, once it moves to the calling servlet or the calling page, the control does not come back to the caller, and the caller should not write anything to the client. Now let's look at send redirect. Send redirect is generally used when the page is moved, or you're going to change the page which actually was supposed to be called. Suppose I have servlet 1 which you are calling till now. Now what I did was I wrote servlet 2, which actually should be the one which should be processing, or the entire page is changed. So what we do is, or moved, So what we do is, when you still might be calling the same servlet, servlet 1, in servlet 1 we will redirect you to the new page which has been changed to. So in order to call send redirect, we use the response object. Using the response object, we invoke the method called send redirect. To the send redirect, you are supposed to pass a string, and that string is nothing but a URL, not the URI. Remember, with forward or include we said URI. Here with send redirect, it's a URL as a string. So specify whatever the page that needs to be redirected to. Even in send redirect, do not do a out.println, but if you do, it's not an error. For forward, if you write a out.println, it's an error. Here with send redirect, out.println is not an error, but it's just that you don't see the contents. You won't be able to see the contents. That's because as soon as you call for send redirect, the response is written to the client by writing into its headers two properties, that is the location and the temporarily moved. These are the two headers that get set by send redirect method call, and sends a response to the client browser. From the client browser, immediately it moves to the specified URL, and that URL gives a response to the client. So since the movement is almost immediate, the output, whatever you might have written using out.println, will not be visible to you. Rather, you won't be able to see, because it's a fast movement from the response to the redirected page. As you notice here with send redirect, we mentioned that the output is written to the client browser by setting the response header details, and then it makes a call to the specified URL from the client browser and then gets back the response from that URL. So which means to say we are making a trip to the client, from the client to the server again, and from the server we get back a response again. So it's a totally different request we are making. It's totally a separate request to the specified URL. It's not the same request which we made to the servlet which calls the send redirect. And it goes to the client and back to the server. In case of forward, it's within the same request, and it's only at the server side. The forward happens from one page to another page. It does not come back to the client in between. So it's having the same request object. It's within the same client request. You're making a call to another page, and it occurs at the server side itself. Whereas send redirect, it occurs at the client, because you are writing this URL to the client, and from that client you are going to the specified URL. So it's two different requests. So the same request content will not be available for the redirected page, therefore. Now coming on to client pull. Client pull is somewhat similar to send redirect, but with some time span. You might have heard of meta tag in HTML, or probably come across it. Meta tag has a HTTP EQIV, which is a server equivalent tag. It's called as a server equivalent meta tag. With HTTP EQIV, you might specify content is equal to HTTP EQIV is equal to refresh, content is equal to how many seconds, and the URL of the page to be called. The equivalence of this meta tag is setting up a header details for refresh header, and that's called as a client pull concept. So for client pull, what you do is, in your servlet, you say response dot set header. Here you set the refresh header, specifying after how many seconds you want to refresh the page and the URL of the page that has to be called. So again here, with the refresh header, you can specify out.println. When you specify out.println and set the header refresh, the output is given to the client and you are able to see the output that you have written, because only after 10 seconds it will make a call to this URL. So till 10 seconds the content that has been written is visible, so you can still be able to view the content or the response. After 10 seconds, it automatically makes a call to the specified URL. That's why it's called as a client pull. Who from the client browser itself, we make a call to the specified URL. So it's a new request to the specified URL out here, but after the given amount of time. That's how send redirect is different from client pull concept. Now maybe I might not specify this URL, rather I just say how many seconds. In that case, what happens is, after 10 seconds it will call to the same page again. So it's as if you are refreshing page. If you were to refresh, how it displays or brings back or reloads the same page, that's what happens out here when the URL is not specified. So this is the client pull concept. So please note the differences between servlet chaining, forward, send redirect and client pull. In case of servlet chaining, it has to be sequence of servlets only, but whereas in case of forward or include or send redirect and client pull, it can be any page, any web page. In case of servlet chaining, an output can be given. An output of one servlet becomes an input to a next servlet, and the last servlet gives an output to the client. In case of a forward, you're going to specify the URI for the page that has to be called. It could be any web page, it doesn't have to be a servlet. Forward also occurs at the server side itself, just like the servlet chaining. But the difference is you do not give any output from one servlet as an input to a next servlet. It's just that you're going to do some processing and call a forward. But the same request object is available to the further pages. In case of send redirect, the output is written to the client. From the client you go to the specified URL and come back with a result. In case of client pull also, the output is written to the client, and from the client you go to the specified URL, come back with a page, new page. But the difference here is it goes after whatever the specified time, and it's not an immediate transfer to the URL. Now let's look at the next part, that is error handling. How do we handle errors or exceptions in a servlet? By default, what happens is, whatever errors apart from IO exception and servlet exception, you need to handle using a try catch. If you want to handle IO exception and servlet exception, you are more than welcome by writing a try catch block. But if you want to pass it across, you can pass across the servlet exception and the IO exception to the container by writing a throws clause to your doGet or the doPost method. What the servlet container does in that case is it will generate a error code for your exception, and depending on the error code it also has a default page to be displayed. So the error code will be set as part of the response header, and then it sends it to the browser. The browser for that particular error code, it will have a specific page to display. So you might have seen 404 page not found error, 500 server internal error. You might have come across these when you are executing pages on the browser. You can handle these errors to display your own user-friendly page. To do so, you need to write certain tags in the web.xml file, either for your exceptions or for your error codes, whichever the way you might want to handle it. Similarly, for any other exception which is not servlet exception type and IO exception type, if at all you want to pass across to the container these exceptions, then you must write user defined exception class derived from servlet exception, because it's only the servlet exception and IO exception you can pass across. So any subclass of servlet exception and IO exception can be passed across to the container, and you can tell the container what is the page to be displayed due to that exception. This is one way of handling it. Another way is, due to an exception, you can call a send error method of the response object, specifying the error code and the message to be displayed at the client browser. So what are the two ways? Let's say in your servlet class S1 extends HTTP servlet you might have your try catch block In the try block, you have set of instructions to be executed. Close the try. You'll have your catch block. Maybe here you're trying to open DB connection, let's assume. So which means you're going to get a servlet exception. Sorry, SQL exception. Of course, you cannot use throws SQL exception here because the signature of doGet or the doPost is to use throws of IO exception and servlet exception. So you have to have a try catch to handle it. So how do you display some error message due to not being able to connect to a database, so you cannot further process? You want to display some sort of a user-friendly message. You do a response.sendError of the error code, that's int value, comma, string, the message to be displayed. So let's assume there are only set of error codes available, predefined error codes, 400, 404, 500, 300, like this. So you have to use one of those error codes and specify the message. So let's assume that we use 404, comma, the message. Let's say we just want to display DB down. So as soon as you call for the send error method, it sets the header details for the response, setting the error code and the message, and immediately sends it to the client browser. So do not have any statements after send error. Doesn't make any, even if you have, it's not an error, but it doesn't make any difference because it's not going to execute the content after send error. So in your browser window, for 404, the page it will display, but with the message DB down, along with the message saying DB down. The problem with send error is that these error codes might not suffice for the type of error that is occurring, because it does not make sense for me to map 404, which is page cannot be found sort of error message, with database being down probably. So this is a drawback with using a send error method. So another method we said which can be used to handle errors or exceptions in your servlet is by deriving your own user defined exception class from the servlet exception class, because you can use throws of servlet exception on your doGet method. There is one more thing that you can do for whenever an error occurs, is that you might want to log all the errors at your server side. So if at all you want to take a look at them at some point of time, you have the entire record of what's happening. So in order to log, you have a method called log, to which you pass the message. So let's say SQLE is passed here, or SQLE.print stack trace, or get message. So this goes and sits in the log file which has been configured for your Tomcat server. Now let's go to the second method of handling errors, that is by user defined exceptions. So if you want to define your own exception class, so you define it as class, let's assume we call it as MySQL exception. We will extend this from Servlet exception, so we can pass it on to the container. Here you can write your constructors like we did during exception handling. Pass the message to your parent constructor by calling super out here. So you have your user defined servlet exception class. Now whenever SQL exception gets generated, what you do is you throw your user defined exception which means to say you need to have a throws clause here. Say throws throws servlet exception Since you are using throws on the doGet method, whom does this get passed to? It gets passed to the container finally, because who's calling the doGet? Remember, the service method, public service method, is called by the container. So the service, public service method down the line calls the doGet method. So it keeps propagating up till the container. Now the container gets this particular servlet exception. He will generate an error code for this particular exception as required and sends it to the browser. Now again, as I said, you can handle that by specifying your own user-defined or user-friendly page in web.xml file for your servlet exception, which the container can therefore handle by sending your own page. Another thing is, if you don't want to be specifically saying servlet exception out here, you can mention it as MySQL exception, because MySQL exception is of type servlet exception. Another thing is, remember we used the send error method just a while back using the response object, specifying the error code and the message. Now let's assume that the message that I want to send across is a stack trace for the exception. How would you do it? If you were to say sqle.print stack trace always sends it to the console. But you want to send it to the browser, client browser. In order to send it to the client browser, there is a print stack trace which takes a print writer object as parameter. You need to use this particular function or the method. Now remember, do not use this particular concept while deploying this web application for real time, because you wouldn't want the end user to see a stack trace. He would not understand what that stack trace is all about. This is useful only for the development purpose when you are testing your clients, so you can find out what exception might be occurring. So if at all you want to execute this, here I need to pass a string value, right? So let us write a method, user defined method, which is going to return a string for the stack trace. And let's call that method as ERRMSG. And to this ERRMSG, we will pass the exception object, so we can do a stack trace out there in that method. So we will have a private string ERRMSG, which takes an exception object as parameter. In this method, what you do is create a byte array output stream object. Let's say called as bytes. Create a print writer object. Let's call PW. possibly via URL rewriting. But if you don't want URL rewriting at all and it's only via cookies, then the URL is specified in the usual manner. So these are the different methods of session tracking. Now, one more point to be noted. We spoke about send redirect, redirecting requests. That is, we used response dot send redirect method. We just showed to pass a URL as a string out here. You should actually use, whenever you are using send redirect, response dot encode redirect URL of specify the URL out here. Why is this so? Because let's assume the servlet within which I am specifying this send redirect, with that URL I am passing some extra path information as a URL rewriting, of course. So what this encode redirect URL does is, to the specified URL, it will pick up the extra path info from the requested URL, attaches that extra path info to this particular URL and returns it as a string to the send redirect method. So when I am sending back the URL to be called, it will call with this extra path information. So I still do a session tracking. I still pass across the session tracking concept. That's why we need to use encode redirect URL out there. So these are the various concepts in Servlet. We'll take a lunch break.